Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Viking.TV. My name is William Thayer, and I'm able to give you this lecture due to the great technical work of James from my office in San Diego. And the very first thing I want to say is I think we should be encouraged. I'm going to give you a little bit of encouragement in this year of COVID from my personal experience, and that is this card, if you can see that. Okay, and that is my vaccination card. I've received my first COVID vaccination shot. That was Moderna, and my second one is coming just 3 days from now. So I'm hoping that everybody else gets vaccinated as soon as possible. So next slide, or first slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about the Russian Revolution. And as Anthony Britain did yesterday, when you're talking about Russia, Russia has kind of a long, painful history. So it's not a lot of laughs. And the Russian Revolution fits in kind of with his yesterday, which was the siege of Leningrad. But the Russian Revolution is extremely important history. I think if I look back on the 20th century and somebody said, what are the three most important things that happened in the 20th century, I would say World War I, World War II, and the Russian Revolution. So it's right up there at the top in importance. Maybe it's not an uplifting lecture, but it is absolutely critically important for world history, for Russian history, and certainly if you're going to St. Petersburg, it's important to understand what happened there. Okay, next slide. Now, my background is technical. I really spent about 30 years in satellites as an engineer, and before that I was designing aircraft, and I was a pilot, and that's kind of technical. And I'm talking about history. So how did that happen? And it happened, I can tell you a little bit easier from home by showing you this book. I'm hoping that you can see that book. Yeah, there we go. Okay, it's Caesar's World, and it's Roman history. And my mother gave this to me when I was 6 years old. And I couldn't read the big words, but I could read the little words. Pretty soon I was reading the whole book, and it was Roman history. I mean, I'd had Jack and Jill books before, but this was my first history book, and I was hooked. That was just fascinating. After that, I went to the Iliad and the Odyssey. In fact, right now, if it wasn't for COVID, I'd be on a Viking cruise in the Greek Isles talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey. But anyway, I've been hooked on history. I've got a personal library of 8,000 books, 5,000 hard copy books. You can see some of them behind me, but I've got really 3 rooms in the house where I've got my books, and 3,000 ebooks. Now, how long have I been reading about communism? And that starts pretty much back in 1948 that I got my first Roman history book. In 1949, I learned about the communists. I was just 7 years old. And that came about because my father was a design engineer on the DC-4 aircraft. Well, in 1948-49 was the Berlin airlift. Okay, and the DC-4 aircraft was the backbone of that airlift. Well, so my dad told me about the Berlin airlift. I knew where Germany was because we just defeated the Germans in the Second World War. I knew where Berlin was because that was the capital of Germany. I didn't know who these communists were and who this guy Stalin was. So my dad gave me the once-over, and then I started reading about communism, and right after that was the Korean War. And so I've been reading pretty extensively on communism for the last 70 years. Well, I've also traveled to Russia a number of times. And it's not just been reading about Russia. My very first trip to Europe was 1961. I was in Berlin in the summer of 1961. That's when the Berlin Wall went up. So, and then in 1972, I got an interest tour to, I was a student at the time, a tour of Russia, and went to 6 of the cities. I got actually to a 7th city that probably I wasn't supposed to get to. And that was quite an experience with communism. And on Viking, I've been to St. Petersburg 4 times. So it's been a lot of Russian experience. Down here at the bottom of this slide, I have Kerensky 1961. So I'm not sure if you know who Kerensky is, but next slide. This is Alexander Kerensky. Now, if you know anything about the Russian Revolution, you probably know who Alexander Kerensky was. If you don't know too much, I mean, you know that the Russian Revolution happened, but you never heard of this guy Kerensky. He's very important. Really, what happened was this. The fate of Russia would be decided by two people. You'd have Lenin on the left and Kerensky representing the democracy, the provisional government on the right, and they would be dueling for the fate of Russia, okay? And I was able to meet Kerensky as a freshman at Stanford in 1961. Kerensky, up at the upper left, is how he looked in 1917 when he was the head of the Russian government, the provisional government. And at the right, he's 83 years old. He's a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution of War, Revolution, and Peace, which is on the Stanford campus. I was a freshman. We were studying Western civilization. We were studying about the Russian Revolution. He came over to our dorm. He gave us a lecture on the Russian Revolution for a half an hour and then opened it up to questions. Oh, God, what an opportunity. What a historic figure. So, of course, I'm not shy about asking questions, and I hope you're not shy about asking me questions today. So the first question I asked him was, were the Russians a majority? And he said, oh, no. They were a tiny minority. And I said, well, gosh, if they were a tiny minority, how did they take over the whole country? And he said, well, they were very well organized and they were utterly ruthless. Absolutely true. What he didn't say is, by the way, I made two fatal mistakes that enabled Lenin to win. Okay, and that's going to be an important part of this lecture. Next slide. So the outline of today's lecture is really the Russian Revolution was not just one revolution, it's three revolutions. Okay, it first started in 1905, and this was at the time of the Russian-Japanese War. When you lose a war, you're weakened on your home front. Your opponents will try to have a revolution or a coup against you, and that's what happened in 1905. The Russians lost the war against the Japanese, and as a result, prior to the war, we had just the autocratic czar. After the war, he had to share power with a Duma, or a parliament. Okay. Then in 1917, you had the czar and the Duma sharing power. But again, Nicholas managed to do very, very poorly in World War I, so he was forced to abdicate. That left just the Duma, okay? And then late in 1917, the Bolsheviks came along and they were able to overthrow the democracy. So those are the three Russian revolutions. Next slide, please. So you got to understand the Russian opposition to understand the Russian revolutions. Next slide, please. This chart is an attempt to do that. I don't think it's real good, so I've redrawn that, but at least it's useful to give you the four basic parts of Russian society. At the very top was the aristocracy, and they had 40% of the land. Underneath them was the middle class. That was about 10 million people. And then under them were the industrial workers. That was 3 million people. And you can see they're overrepresented in this pyramid, which is why I'm going to redraw that. 3 million people, because basically Russia wasn't industrialized. This is 1905. And then what Russia truly was were peasants. It was an agrarian society, 100 million peasants out of 115 million people. Next slide, please. So I've redrawn this a little bit. So up at the top, you had the aristocracy. That's about 2 million people. They have 40% of the land. At the bottom, you have the industrial workers, 3 million people, almost the same size as the aristocracy. Okay, so communism, Marx said, workers of the world, unite, get rid of your change. You've only got to lose your change. He didn't say peasants of the world unite. So he didn't think that communism would actually succeed in Russia because there was hardly any industrial workers. And it's an amazing story of how the party, one of the two parties that represented the industrial workers, the Bolsheviks, managed to come out on top. You can see it's the peasants that are the most numerous. Their party was the Social Revolutionaries. They should have won. Next slide. So to emphasize this again, the Russian opposition came from the peasants and from the industrial workers primarily. The peasants, 100 million, their party was the Social Revolutionaries. Their issue was they wanted more land. Okay, the workers, or the industrial workers, there were 3 million in 1905, probably only 5 million in 1917. And they were split between two groups, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. So let me explain what that means. Menshevik means minority, Bolshevik means majority. Okay, and the leaders of the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks had to exile themselves from Russia or be sent to Siberia. So a lot of them ended up in Switzerland, and they had a big convention, and they split into two groups. One group wanted Marxism, wanted socialism, but they wanted democracy. That was the Mensheviks. They were the larger of the group. And the smaller group wanted control of the industrial workers and dictatorship of the proletariat. They did not want to share power with anybody else. Dictatorship of the proletariat really meant not dictatorship of the workers, but dictatorship of the Communist Party. Even though they were the smaller group, it was headed by Lenin. Lenin was a very good propagandist, and he said, we are the majority, we are the Bolsheviks. So that's where the word Bolshevik came from. The Mensheviks, they knew they were the majority. They said, oh, it's Lenin, we don't care. You know, he can call us Mensheviks if he wants. But the Bolsheviks would call themselves Bolsheviks up until the end of 1917, 1918, they decided to call themselves communists. So Bolshevik, communists, same thing. Next slide, please. Now, assassinations played an important part of Russian history and will influence, of course, Lenin. And you've got to kind of understand kind of the flow of the czars in Russian history. So in the 1800s, this is a very, very quick summary. Alexander I, he was a very capable czar. He was the grandson of Catherine the Great. He helped defeat Napoleon. His son, a little less skillful, Nicholas I, he got in a war with the British and the French and Crimean War, along with the Ottomans, and it was a disastrous war for the Russians. His son was Alexander II. When Nicholas died, Alexander II took over. He ended that Crimean War as fast as he could. And he was a capable czar, and he realized that really he needed to start sharing power and to liberalize Russia. So what he did is he ended serfdom. Unfortunately, before he could do more reforms, he was assassinated. Now, his son then was Alexander III. He went back. He said, well, if reforms didn't work, we're going to go back to the strong autocratic czar. And then his son was the very incompetent Nicholas, who took over, managed to lose the Russian-Japanese War and pretty much lose the World War I for the Russians. Next slide, please. So Tsar Alexander II was assassinated as he was riding across this particular square in his coach. Basically, the terrorists just rolled bombs underneath the coach and blew up the coach. He was mortally wounded. His legs were what was really injured, and they took him over to the Hermitage. You go through the Hermitage, you ask the guys, they might show you where they tried to treat him. But of course, the doctors in the 1800s had no way of saying anything, so he died. Now, obviously, some people hated the Tsar, but a lot of people loved the Tsar too. He was the father of the Russian people. That's what many people considered. So what they did is they had voluntary contributions from all around Russia. This is voluntary contributions, and with that money, they built this beautiful church. And you'll see this on the Viking Included tour. The Viking Included tour is a bus tour that goes around St. Petersburg, and you'll see all the main sites of St. Petersburg. It's a great orientation tour. All the Viking Included tours are really superb. I've been there 4 times. Every time I go on the Viking Included tour. That's how good it is. Now, they also have an excursion that will get you inside the church, and there's beautiful mosaics inside the church, so I recommend that as well. But I definitely recommend the Viking Included tour. Next slide, please. Now, Alexander III, he was the victim of an attempted assassination, but it didn't work. And there were lots of assassinations, so I'm only talking about 2 here. There were thousands of them. But this one was important because of who did it. And this was the 21-year-old that organized the assassination team. This was Alexander Ulanovsky. Well, people say, who's Alexander Ulanovsky? He's the older brother of Vladimir Ulanovsky. And of course, Vladimir Ulanovsky dropped his name because he didn't want the secret police to get him, and he took the name of Lenin. So you know him by Vladimir Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin's older brother was executed by the Tsar. You can imagine that probably embittered Vladimir Lenin just a little bit. Now, the very, very interesting thing in the category of history is a little bit stranger than fiction is this. Alexander Ulanovsky, his brother Vladimir Ulanovsky, or Lenin, and Alexander Kerensky, who will later be duking it out with Lenin for control of Russia, all came from the same town in Russia, Simbirsk. If you look for it on Google, you won't find it today. It's called Ulanovsk, but it's the town of Simbirsk. So if we have Moscow up here, we have the Caspian Sea down here, and we have the Volga River coming down, where it turns south, that is where the town of Simbirsk was. So that's where they came from. They were all taught by Alexander Kerensky's father, who recommended them all for the best university in St. Petersburg. Kind of interesting. Next slide, please. So the first Russian Revolution was a result of the Russian-Japanese War. Next slide, please. So basically it was this. The Japanese were under the Meiji Reformation, or Restoration really, were expanding as Imperial Japan, and they essentially controlled Korea, and they wanted to go into Manchuria, but the Russians were in Manchuria, and so the Japanese wanted to get them out. And the Russians also had Port Arthur, which at one time had belonged to the Japanese, so they wanted to get them out of Port Arthur as well. So they did a sneak attack on the Russian ships at Port Arthur, sank those ships. As a response to that, the Russian Tsar Nicholas, sent his fleet around the world, and basically they were intercepted at the Strait of Tsushima, and most of them were sunk. And then as a result of that, there was a revolution. The revolution was ended by negotiation and the creation of the Duma. Next slide, please. So this is just a little quick geography of where all this happened. The arrow at the right points at Vladivostok, okay? And the Russians were building the Trans-Siberian Railroad through Russia to Vladivostok. Well, it's pretty hard in that area, the brown area is Russia. It's pretty hard to build a train through there. It was much easier to come straight across Manchuria, which is that white area and the red area. So from the upper left to the lower right down to Vladivostok, train went right across Manchuria. Well, this upset the Japanese. In addition to that, Vladivostok is a very nice harbor, but it freezes over about 4 months of the year. And the Russians wanted a warm water port, so they got that down at the left arrow, which is at Port Arthur. This is land that they leased from the Chinese. Okay, now it was originally controlled by the Japanese, so that was another thing that infuriated the Japanese. So they did the sneak attack there at Port Arthur. They knew that when the Russians sent their fleet around the world, they'd go to Vladivostok because they had to get more coal, more fuel, so they could come out and sail again and fight against the Japanese. And the Japanese said, this is the place to attack them, Straits of Tsushima. Next slide, please. So this is the Straits of Tsushima. You can see it's pretty narrow between Korea and Japan, and there's an island right in the middle, and the Russians had to go left or right, and the Japanese figured, and they had reconnaissance ships out, and they knew exactly where they were. They brought their fleet out, they're fresh, and it was just an absolute slaughter. And nearly every Russian ship was sunk, and you can see the casualties were 10,000 dead for the Russians, 100 dead for the Japanese. So it was a pretty one-sided battle. One of the ships managed to escape here. It was the cruiser Aurora. It turned around from the Straits of Tsushima and went down to the Philippines. It was interred in Manila. That was controlled by the Americans at the time. Americans had the protectorate of the Philippines. So that ship, cruiser Aurora, will figure into the Russian Revolution later on. Next slide, please. So when you're weak, when you've had a military failure, all your enemies come out. And the workers came out against the Tsar. So this is in St. Petersburg, not at a place that we'll go. It's much further in the southern part of St. Petersburg. And this is Father Gapon, one of the Orthodox priests, leading workers against the Russian army troops. They said, don't come any closer or we'll fire. They fired, and this was known as Bloody Sunday. Next slide. The revolution was all over Russia. It wasn't as extensive as 1917, but there was barricades all over. This is Moscow. And what the solution was, not Nicholas, but his cabinet negotiated with the revolutionary leaders, and they said, okay, we'll agree to share power. It's no longer going to be a czar, autocratic czar. We will create a Duma, so we'll be sharing power. Next slide. And this is a picture of the Duma of 1905. So it's a one house, not like the United States where you have a House and a Senate. It's just one parliament like you have in most European countries. So there's about 700 deputies here. Next slide, please. This is the makeup of the, and it's not quite to scale. I can't quite do it to scale. But these are the parties that made up the Duma. So at the right, you'll see the Liberal Party, that's blue, okay? And that represented the middle class. So the people that owned a shoe shop or maybe a grocery store, or maybe they were a telegraph operator or, you know, something like that, educator, they were in the middle class. That was the liberals. The social revolutionaries, the pink, and it's really not to scale. That would just go all the way across this slide. That represented the peasants. That was really what Russia was, 100 million peasants. And again, not to scale, because in 1905, there were only 3 million industrial workers, but they were split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks, of course, supporting democracy, as did the social revolutionaries, as did the liberals. The only party that did not support democracy was the Bolsheviks at the far left, and they probably represented a fraction of the 3 million industrial workers. Okay, next slide. Revolution 2, this will be during World War I. This is 1917. Next slide. So this is a very, very quick summary of World War I from the Russian point of view. The left arrow is pointing at a dotted line. That's roughly the border between Germany and Austria-Hungary at the start of the war. By 1917, the Germans had pushed them back to the yellow line. That's the second arrow in the middle. And it was tremendous Russian casualties and much Russian prisoners of war. It was really much worse than this line shows. It was very discouraging for everybody in Russia. Nobody was happy with how the war was progressing. Now, just as a point of information, I have a third arrow pointing at the dotted line at the right. That was at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That was after the Russian Revolution. And there, Lenin agreed to anything that the Germans wanted so that he could have control of Russia. So basically, he gave up everything to the left of that dotted line. Next slide, please. These two pictures pretty much tell the story of what was happening to Russia in the First World War. When they went up against the Germans had better weapons, they were better trained, they had better artillery, and it was pretty much a slaughter. So the Russians, when they were attacked by the Germans, would just throw down their rifles in many cases and just run, just as this picture shows. And the picture at the lower right shows the prisoners of war. There were more Russians that surrendered and became prisoners of war than prisoners of war from Germany, Britain, and France combined, because nobody was really motivated to fight for the Tsar. Okay, next picture. Next slide. Now, part of the reason that the war was running poorly is that the Tsar and Tsarina were unduly influenced by Rasputin. They were not particularly good leaders to begin with, but getting advice from Rasputin was even worse. Rasputin, we don't know who he was exactly. He did come from Siberia. He said he was a monk. Nobody's quite sure. The propaganda poster at the left shows Rasputin having undue influence over the Tsar and Tsarina. And that's absolutely true. And it kind of shows him as a pretty scary picture, pretty scary person. And if you look at his actual picture on the right, in my opinion, he is a pretty scary person. But not to the, particularly not to the aristocratic women of St. Petersburg. They loved him. He was a man of God, and he had almost hypnotic control over him. And through his friends in the female aristocracy, he met the Tsarina Alexandria and the Tsar. And how did he get influence with the Tsar and Tsarina? Next slide, please. This is a picture of the Tsar and Tsarina and their family, and you see their son, Alexis, down there. He would be the next Tsar. Well, the deepest, darkest secret of all of Russia was that he had hemophilia, and nobody knew this because they didn't want anybody to know that he had this vulnerability. Well, Rasputin comes into St. Petersburg. He meets the people in the aristocracy. He meets the Tsar and Tsarina, and he says, "I know that your son has hemophilia." And the Tsar is just like, "What? How can you know that my son has hemophilia? You know, I mean, this guy must have magic powers or something to know this, because nobody knows that." And what Rasputin said to them was this. He said, "Look, I know he's being treated by doctors, and he's not getting better. And I want you to trust me. I want you to send the doctors away, and I will pray for your son, and he will improve." Well, the Tsar and Tsarina go, "You know, what do we got to lose? The doctors aren't doing a good job." So they sent the doctors away, okay? And Rasputin prayed for the Tsarevich, the little boy, and he did improve. Well, that was it for the Tsar and Tsarina. This Rasputin really was a man of God. He had unusual powers. Okay, so they had total faith in his advice. Well, what happened was this. Hemophilia is a very painful disease. I know because when I grew up in Santa Monica, the two boys that lived behind me, the Churchills, had hemophilia, and it's painful. And so it was painful for the poor little Alexis. And so what the doctors were prescribing for pain was aspirin. Well, that just makes you bleed worse. So they were making the hemophilia that much worse. They didn't realize that at the time, of course. So when the doctors went away, the aspirin went away, the child improved, and Rasputin was the advisor to the Tsar and Tsarina. Next slide. So the aristocracy knows, oh my God, we're losing the war because the Tsar and Tsarina are paying attention to this guy Rasputin. I mean, there's not enough food for the people in the city. There's not enough food for the troops at the front. There's not enough ammunition or rifles for the troops at the front. We don't have enough artillery. It's a total mess. What we've got to do is we've got to get rid of Rasputin. We've got to assassinate this guy. So Prince Yusupov is going to do this with his co-conspirators. He's on the left. His palace is on the right, the Yusupov Palace. This is also a Viking excursion, which I highly recommend, to see what a palace looks like. It's unbelievable inside. They even have their own private theater with a balcony in it. Unbelievable opulence. Okay, but it's also where Rasputin was killed. So if you look at the columns at the front of the palace, the one on the lower left, and you look at the window in the lower left, that's about where Rasputin was assassinated. Okay, so here's the story. Next slide. So when you go there, they'll take you down to this room, and this is where Rasputin was actually assassinated. And these, of course, are mannequins, Yusupov on the left and Rasputin on the right. Now, Rasputin was a big man. He had the strength of a horse, okay? And so what they planned to do to assassinate him was to give him poison cake in strong wine, strong tasting wine that also had poison in it. So they come down here, they give it to them, and he eats all the cake, and he drinks the wine, and he says, "Could I have some more?" Yusupov is just, and they put enough poison in there to kill a horse. Yusupov just doesn't know what to do. He runs upstairs to his co-conspirators, says, "Hey, I gave him all the cake. I gave him all the wine. He's asking for more." And they're going, "Well, take him down some more cake, some more wine, and then shoot him." And so that's what he did. Took him down some more cakes, some more wine. And where I'm taking this picture, there's an alcove like the picture you see on the other side there. There's an alcove like this, but it has a cross. And so Yusupov asked Rasputin to come over, kneel down in front of the cross and pray for the troops. And that's what Rasputin did. Yusupov walks up behind him and shoots him in the back. And then he runs back upstairs to his co-conspirators and said, hey, I killed him. Come on downstairs and see the dead Rasputin. They come downstairs and Rasputin is staggering to his feet. He points at Yusupov and he says, I'm going to tell the Tsarina on you. And then he goes through the door just to the right of where this picture is and staggers out to the front street. Of course, they run out and catch him, shoot him a few more times. But it doesn't look too good to have a dead body in front of the Yusupov palace. So they pick up his body and they go down a couple blocks. This is on a canal. It's in the middle of winter. They knock a hole in the ice and they stuff him through the hole in the ice. Well, of course, the shots are heard by people. The police come out. They find the hole in the ice. They pull the body out. He's still breathing. Unbelievable. So when I first came on the tour of the Yusupov Palace, and they have a local guide that will take you through the Yusupov Palace, I was wondering what she was going to tell about the story of the assassination of Rasputin. And she was a very good guide. She said, there's many stories about how Rasputin died. And then she pretty much gave the story that I just gave. Next slide. Well, Rasputin's killed, but it really didn't change anything because now Tsar Nicholas, because the war was going bad, went to the army headquarters at Mogilev in the center of Russia. So he was out of St. Petersburg. So the only person running St. Petersburg is Tsarina Alexandra. She has tough time running a household, let alone a country. So it was just total chaos. And so everything was going down. There's demonstrations and the country is just falling apart. So Tsar Nicholas says, well, I've got to come back from the headquarters to St. Petersburg. But the revolutionaries controlled the trains. So he stopped out in the middle, halfway between Mogilev and St. Petersburg. He stopped out in the middle of nowhere, and eventually he has to abdicate. So what we had, remember, we had the Tsar, the autocratic Tsar, we had the Duma, okay? The Tsar just abdicated. This only leaves the Duma, the parliament, which declared itself the provisional government. Okay, it's the democracy. It was Russia's chance for democracy. Next slide. This is just some of the demonstrations that went on that resulted in his abdication. Next slide. And this is the Duma that was finally set up. Okay, now where it was set up was in this palace down here at the lower right. This is Prince Potemkin's palace, also called the Taurida Palace. It's further east in St. Petersburg. We will not see this on the included tour, but you see the two wings of the palace. Well, the Duma was meeting, and here's a picture of the Duma, was meeting in one side of the palace, one of those wings, and in the other wing were the Congress of the Soviets. Okay, so I'll have to explain what the Congress of the Soviets were later. But the provisional government was meeting in one of those wings. It will later move to the Mariinsky Palace, and I will show you a picture of that later on. Next slide. So the four people that are going to determine the destiny of Russia are in this picture. Alexander Kerensky is going to be the head of the provisional government. He starts out as the head of the Justice Department, then the Defense Department, then he's the Prime Minister. Following right behind him is his right-hand man, right beneath him, Boris Savenkov. Okay, both of these people are social revolutionaries on the left, so they're representing the peasants. On the right are the Bolsheviks. That's Lenin on the top and Trotsky on the bottom. Lenin, he was the propagandist. He was the one who founded the Bolshevik Party. He was really not a very good tactician at getting things done. That was Trotsky. Trotsky was the man of action. Next slide. So again, let me show you this slide that I showed you before. I'm just adding in Lenin and Kerensky here. Now remember, the social revolutionary element is really understated in this thing. It's really 100 million peasants against Lenin might have represented 2 million industrial workers. It's really 50 against 1, odds of 50 against 1. So when Kerensky said at our freshman dorm they were a small minority, he wasn't kidding. How do you lose, or how do you win when the odds are 50 to 1 against you? Well, it's a pretty interesting story. Next slide. So there's other countries, of course, that want to have a say in Russia's future, particularly as should it continue in World War I. Of course, Germany doesn't want to fight Russia. They want them out, okay? And the only political party in Russia that wants to stop the war immediately, and in fact, Lenin wanted to stop it when war was declared in 1914, that was Lenin and the Bolsheviks. It's the Mensheviks want to continue the war. They want to drive the Germans out of Russia. But the Germans and Lenin are in agreement. Russia should not be in the war, and that's going to affect things very much. Now, Britain and France, of course, want Russia to continue in the war. Otherwise, those German troops that are in Russia will come over to the French front, and they did in 1918, and it was a pretty close run thing in 1918. The provisional government, okay, these are the liberals, the social revolutionaries, and the Mensheviks. They all want to continue the war against Russia. Okay, next slide. So what the Germans realize is that if they're going to support somebody that wants to get Germany out of the war, their one and only choice is to support the Bolsheviks. Now, they despise the Bolsheviks for their socialist views, but they totally support them to pull Russia out of the war. And as I said, the Bolsheviks that were not in prison in Siberia were in Switzerland, and that's where Lenin is with his closest 35 co-conspirators. He wants to get back to St. Petersburg. The Germans want to get him back to St. Petersburg, but there's Germany and Austria in between him and St. Petersburg. So he can't really get back to St. Petersburg. But the Germans say, hey, we'll get you back there. He says, yeah, but that's going to make me look like a German front man. Excuse me. Which, in fact, he would be. So they say, hey, we'll give you this closed train across Germany. What that means, no German's going to set foot on that train. You get to northern Germany, you take a ferry to Sweden, you get on the train in Sweden, and you go to St. Petersburg. And it's going to look like you have no contact with the Germans. Of course they did. They get to Stockholm, and not Lenin, but his right-hand man, Karl Radek, meets with the German representative. They get millions of dollars, and the Germans will support them throughout the time that they are in Russia as they take over Russia. And the way they do this is when they're in St. Petersburg, one of the ways they do this, they have a lot of pharmaceutical fronts the Germans did in St. Petersburg. So a Bolshevik would walk into a drugstore and he'd buy a bottle of aspirin for 2 rubles. He'd get the bottle of aspirin and he'd get 100,000 rubles in change. And this is what the Bolsheviks used to support their newspaper, Pravda, and all their propaganda. They were extremely good at propaganda. Next chart. Now, what Kerensky is going to do, he's in charge of the government, and he's going like, what we need to do is we need to unify this country, and we'll unify this country by defeating the Germans, which everybody agreed to except for the Bolsheviks. And what he looked at, because he was a socialist, he looked at the French Revolution. The socialists considered that a socialist revolution. And what they did in France is they overthrew Louis XVI. They also overthrew the regular French military, and then Prussia invaded. And of course, what did the French revolutionaries do? They couldn't rely on the professional military again, so they gave rifles to the ordinary citizens of Paris. Okay, it became a nation in arms, and this untrained rabble of revolutionaries from Paris went out and they defeated the Prussians. So that's what Kerensky's thinking. He's thinking, Yes, the Russians have not fought well before because they were fighting for the Tsar. Now they're fighting for Mother Russia. Okay, it's going to be entirely different. So they line up an offensive and they go attack the Germans, and the same thing that happened every time before happens. The Germans just slaughter them, the Russians throw down their guns, and it's a total chaos. And what happens when you're weak and you lose militarily? Your enemies will try a coup against you. So in July of 1917, the Bolsheviks tried to take over the government from Kerensky. But Kerensky calls in the best general, that's Kornilov, with one of the best divisions from the Baltics. He uses the police, the regular police, not the Okhrana, those are the secret police, they're gone, but the regular police in St. Petersburg, and he puts down this coup and he arrests the top 40 leaders. Next chart, please. So this is a picture of really where one of the centers of the provisional government putting down the Bolshevik coup occurred. Okay, and this is Nevsky Prospect. So Nevsky Prospect, on the included tour, you will drive through this very spot. If you start at the upper left of the picture, you will start there and you will drive down to the lower right. You notice the circular building on the far side of the square. And here's a picture I took from the bus on the included tour, that same circular building. Okay, so you're driving right through where the July 1917 coup was put down. You have to ask somebody on the bus. Really, they won't tell you because they don't want to advertise anything about the communists. But if you keep your eyes open, you'll see this very spot. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the French Revolution, the socialists look at that as a socialist revolution. And what they look at it is, the big lesson that they came out of it is they lost their social revolution, their socialist revolution, to the man on horseback. In other words, what they did in the French Revolution is they had Louis XVI here, and they overthrew him. Then they had kind of a revolutionary period. It was a little rough. I mean, they had Robespierre, they had Marat, they 20,000 people executed in the guillotine. And they ended up with somebody finally restoring order. That was the first council. And then he later declared himself emperor. So what they look at is, we had a king, okay? We had a king, we overthrew him, we had a revolution in between, and then we lost that revolution to the man on horseback. Next slide. This is the man on horseback that they're always talking about. This is Napoleon, okay? So the lesson to the socialist is, even though you might have a successful military leader fighting your fight, you got to watch out because he might get political control. Okay, next slide. I want to emphasize this with an example, more current example from World War II. On the left, of course, we have Stalin. On the right, we have General Zhukov. He was the most successful Russian general. He defended Moscow against the Nazi armies. He conquered Berlin. Okay, so he was by far and away the best Russian general. So what did he do after the war? I mean, was Stalin going to honor him with some high appointment in Moscow? Not on your life. He was afraid of him being the man on horseback. What he did is send him out in the boonies. That was to head the Odessa military district down on the Black Sea. He wanted him as far away from Moscow as he could possibly get him. Next slide. So the July coup was put down very successfully. The police arrested the top 40 Bolshevik leaders. The only person they got Trotsky, but they missed Lenin. I mean, he had to shave his beard off, cut his hair, look like a peasant, escaped towards Finland. Okay, and the Red Guards were the private army of the Bolsheviks. No other political party had their own private army, but the Bolsheviks did because, of course, they wanted to take over. But it was a small group. It was 5,000 to 10,000. So it was pretty easy for one army division and the regular police to put them down. Now, the first of the two fatal mistakes that Kerensky will make is this. The French intelligence are keeping track of the Bolsheviks, okay? And what they're telling Zhivkov is, hey, We know where the next 270 Bolshevik leaders are meeting for 3 days in this mansion, okay? And here's the address. All you got to do is go out and arrest these guys, and you will break the power of the Bolsheviks. And they would have. And they would have, okay? But Kerensky's going, no, that's not what we want to do. Our problem is not the Bolsheviks. I just put those guys down, okay? They're not the problem. Completely underestimating the danger. That's not our problem. Our problem is the man on horseback, Kornilov, the guy that just saved our government. That's the guy we got to worry about. So he says, no, I don't want to arrest him. Next slide. Now, I talked about the Congress of Soviets, so I want to talk about that. It's really kind of a parallel government going on at the same time. So the provisional government is the elected Duma. Okay, the Soviets, what is Soviet? Because it's Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. What does Soviet mean? Soviet in Russian means council. Okay, so let's say we have a factory of 5,000 workers in St. Petersburg. All 5,000 people can't show up, so they have a council that represents it, maybe 5 people, maybe 7 people, something like that. You have a village out in the middle of Russia, it's 5,000 people. Again, you have a Soviet that represents it, maybe five people. Well, if you do the math for just 100,000 peasants, you come up with like 20,000 Soviets and 100,000 people on those councils. You throw in the Soviets of the factories, you have a lot of people. So you have over 100,000 people, and I don't care how big your assembly hall is, you're not going to get 100,000 people in it. So the Congress of the Soviets was really just the Soviets that managed to get in the door and be one of the 700 people inside. And the Bolsheviks were past masters at figuring out who could get in there. And so the Bolsheviks, which were really 2% of the people, had probably 35% representation in the Congress of the Soviets. And they were very, very united. So their 35% representation was probably a lowball estimate of the actual power that they had. In the meantime, they're very good. They're being supported by the Germans with all sorts of money. All the political parties had newspapers that printed their particular point of view, but they all charged money for them, except for Pravda. Pravda was free to everybody because the Germans were paying for it. So if we can look at, how the aid was going, the Germans were aiding the Bolsheviks so they could attack the provisional government, okay? The British and French were aiding the provisional government so they could attack the Germans. If they had just spent 10% of their money attacking the Bolsheviks, history probably would have been different. But that's not the way it happened. So the Bolsheviks were able to build up their private army to 200,000 troops. Next slide, please. So the final revolution, and it's really basically a bloodless revolution. I give this talk and I end this talk, and a woman came up to me afterwards on board ship and she said, I thought that the Russian Revolution was really bloody. Well, I'm ending this talk at the point where the Russians, the Bolsheviks take over Russia. From that point on, it's the Russian Civil War, which is very bloody. But I'm ending my talk just when they seize power, and they seize power basically bloodlessly. Okay, next chart. Again, Savinkov is warned by French intelligence that, hey, it's a bigger coup coming this time from the Bolsheviks. They got more Red Guards, they got more weapons, they're more prepared. So Savinkov is talking to Kornilov saying, hey, we've got a bigger coup. You better get ready to start coming into St. Petersburg with troops again. And in fact, Kerensky and Kornilov are talking. But remember Kerensky's mindset. He's worried about the man on horseback. Okay, that's his fear. He's not worried about the Bolsheviks. Total misjudgment. So he makes fatal mistake number 2. As Kornilov is coming with troops towards St. Petersburg to help him put down the coup that the French intelligence has identified and Savinkov knows about, Kerensky says, Kornilov is coming to depose me so that he can be dictator. He wasn't going to do that at all. So he orders the Russian army, Kornilov is the head of the Russian army, orders the army to arrest Kornilov. Now, if it was truly a coup by the Russian army against Kerensky, they wouldn't have arrested Kornilov, but they do arrest him. Of course, Kerensky has now alienated the army, so he's going to get no further help from them. Additionally, Kerensky is worried about that man on horseback, so he frees those 40 top Bolsheviks that he has arrested, including Trotsky, and that's the most dangerous one. Trotsky goes to the Congress of the Soviets, and he is immediately elected head of the Congress of the Soviets, which gives him control of all the committees. Oh boy, the Bolsheviks are really in control of the Congress of the Soviets now. The last thing that Kerensky does is he says, hey, I got 40,000 rifles. I'm going to give them to the left opposition, the Congress of the Soviets. Okay, I'm going to give them to the left opposition. And he gives them to Trotsky, and Trotsky says, yeah, I'm going to get those out to all the social revolutionaries. He said, yes, sir. You know, and of course, what does he do with those rifles? They go right to the Red Guards. So the Red Guards are the best armed, most powerful force in St. Petersburg, which is Petrograd at this time. They changed the name from St. Petersburg, which sounded German, to Petrograd, which is Petrograd city. Okay, so he gives unknowingly, he gives the Red Guards 40,000 rifles. Next chart. So with Trotsky, the head of the Congress of Soviets, the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks meet, and they go, now's the time for a coup. Lenin and Trotsky are going, now's the time for a coup. Kerensky's made this horrible, horrible mistake, okay? But many of the people on the Central Committee, it's a committee of 12, go, no. Marx said, first thing is the monarchy, and then that transitions to the bourgeois government, and then we take over from the bourgeois government. So this is premature. We don't want to do this. I mean, if he had any hair on his head, Lenin would be pulling out his hair, and he says, God, we've got to do this now. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. So it's a 7-5 vote. They decide to do this. And how it's done is very cleverly implemented by Trotsky, not by Lenin, but by Trotsky. And what he says is, we're going to take over the military. We're going to take over all the critical spots in St. Petersburg, well, Petrograd. We're going to take over all these places in the name of the Congress of the Soviets. And I'm the head of the Congress of the Soviets, so I can do this. But who's taking over all these strategic spots in St. Petersburg? Okay, it's the Bolsheviks. Who takes over the military? It's the Bolsheviks. And the way it worked was very simple. You'd have a Bolshevik sitting down at a desk over there in the Peter and Paul, not a Bolshevik, but just a social revolutionary or somebody else that was a part of the Petrograd military at Peter and Paul Fortress. He'd be sitting down, and at the end of his 8-hour shift, he would get up and go home. And a Bolshevik would be standing right there, and he'd sit right down in the seat. And that's what happened. And over a period of 2 days, they took over the whole military just by simply being there. Okay, next chart. So when Trotsky said, yes, sir, Prime Minister Kerensky, I will distribute those 40,000 rifles, he's giving them to these people. Now, how can you tell who's a social revolutionary and who's a Bolshevik? You can't by looking at these people if you're ordinary. But if you're a Bolshevik, by God, you know which ones are Bolsheviks, and those were the ones that got the rifles. So here are the Red Guards. Next slide. Here's some more pictures of Red Guards. Again, you can't tell who's who. Next picture. Next slide. Okay, so the last remaining plus, now it's been 3 days, and they've been taking over the military. They've taken over the telegraph station. They've taken over the banks. They've taken over all the critical the bridges. They've taken over all the places in St. Petersburg, except for this. This is the Hermitage, and this is where Kerensky is, and this is where the provisional government cabinet is. Well, Kerensky leaves, and I can tell you the story on that if someone wants to know, ask a question. Kerensky leaves to go to the Baltics to rally the army. The provisional government is left in this building. And they are guarded by two groups of people, about 140 each. First is a group of 140 widows. Their husbands have been killed in the war, and so they've taken up arms. They're going to fight the Germans, but they get detailed to guarding the provisional government. And then there's about 140 cadets, 18-year-old kids that are being trained as officers, and they're in here. But what the provisional cabinet says is, we do not want you to fire on anybody. We want no violence. Do nothing. How can you defend the cabinet if you're going to do nothing? So what happened is, this is a picture of the Hermitage, which is the great art museum today, on the square side. On the other side is the river side. Well, the doors were just open. They were unlocked on the other side, and the Bolsheviks just walk in. So you'd have a cadet, he'd be standing there, and pretty soon he'd have a Bolshevik with a rifle standing right next to him on the right, and another Bolshevik with a rifle standing right next to him on the left. And he's going, I'm under orders to do nothing. What the heck am I doing here? And they just left. And when they left, that was it. They just took over the provisional government. That was the moment where the Bolsheviks took total power in Russia. And when they did, they didn't let go for 74 years. Next slide. So this is St. Isaac's, where the Duma, this is one of the places they took over. The Duma moved to this picture in the lower right, was the Mariinsky Palace. So if you're looking at St. Isaac's, as you will be able to see on the included tour, if you just turn around 180 degrees and look in the other direction, that's what you'll see. That's the Mariinsky Palace. That's where the Duma met. That was taken over by the Bolsheviks. Today it's the City Hall of St. Petersburg. Okay, next slide. Now, the communist folklore says that the cruiser Aurora, remember that's the one ship, one of the few ships that survived the Battle of Tsushima, fired a blank round, and then the communists bravely charged across the square, being shot down by all the troops guarding the provisional cabinet inside the Hermitage. Didn't happen that way at all, but this is the communist folklore. Next picture. Next slide. So that's basically the Russian Revolution. 3 revolutions. Okay, before 1905, just the Tsar. Okay, as a result of his defeat in the Russian-Japanese War, he had to share power with the Duma. Again, Nicholas fails again in World War I. He's forced to abdicate. That leaves just the Duma, just democracy in Russia. And then late 1917, the Bolsheviks, with the help of 2 fatal mistakes from Kerensky, get rid of the Duma. Next slide. So in most histories, this really doesn't get the attention that it should get, the 2 fatal mistakes made by Kerensky. The first one was he didn't arrest the 270 Bolshevik leaders. Even if he didn't get Lenin, that would have broken the back of the Bolshevik party. And later on, he alienated the army by having Kornilov arrested. He freed the top 40 Bolsheviks, particularly Trotsky was the really dangerous one, and he unintentionally armed the Red Guards with 40,000 rifles. So that pretty much summarizes the Russian Revolution. Next slide. Now I'm going to run over just a little bit, but I want to show you where these events took place in St. Petersburg. So when you come into St. Petersburg, on Viking ship, you will anchor on the far side of Vasilevsky Island, where I have Viking ship. You get on a bus for the included tour. You'll drive down the river from the lower right that winds around and goes out through by those 2 islands. That's the Neva River. You'll come down to the southern part of Vasilevsky Island. You'll drive along there to the point where you can look across and see the Peter and Paul Fortress. So you see Peter and Paul Fortress there. You'll also be able to see St. Isaac's. Those are the 2 big landmarks to orient you in downtown St. Petersburg. Next slide. So this is a map of St. Petersburg. This is just of the downtown area. So I'm going to try to describe this. I wish I had a pointer to go through this. It'd be a little easier. But you come along in your included tour from on the river on the lower left. You're on the island. That's the upper side of the river. And you'll come to that point where it says Hermitage. You see the red buildings there at the end of the point. You'll come right to that point. You can look right across at the Hermitage. You'll see it. It's a beautiful green building. And then you'll see right out to your other side, you'll see the Peter and Paul Fortress. You'll drive across the bridge there around the Peter and Paul Fortress. You'll go around to the far side of that island to where it says Aurora. That's where the cruiser Aurora is anchored. And then you'll come back towards Peter and Paul Fortress, and the bridge on this side, great big bridge, you'll come across to the green area. That's the plain of Mars. And you'll drive through there and you'll weave around some streets till you get the church on Spilt Blood. That's that beautiful church that was built where Alexander II was assassinated. You'll come down that canal. You'll stop there and get out and take a picture. You'll come down that canal to the Nevsky Prospect, which is the street that's running like this from the lower right to the upper left, and it runs into the red building. That's the Admiralty. You'll drive along that building. Particular building on the left, that's where the July 1917 Bolshevik coup was put down. Then you'll go to where the Admiralty is. You'll come around to St. Isaac's. And again, if you look on the backside of St. Isaac's, you'll see the Mariinsky Palace. That's where the Duma met. The Yusupov Palace, where Rasputin is just down the canal, but that's not part of the included tour. Next slide. I wanted to show you some pictures. This is the Peter and Paul Fortress. So this was the very first thing that was constructed in St. Petersburg. It was wood and in mud originally, and it was upgraded to brick. Basically, St. Petersburg is early 1800s. That's the city, and that's kind of the date of this fortress. And there's a big church with a big tall spire. You'll see this anywhere. As you go around St. Peter Paul Fortress and you go to the upper left of the picture, you'll go to where the Aurora is anchored. There's the Aurora that fired the shot. Come down to the lower left, you see the picture of the church on Spilt Blood. Okay, that's where Alexander II was assassinated. Yusupov Palace, you're not going to get to on the included tour, but I've included that as one of the important buildings in the Russian Revolution. Next chart. This is the Hermitage, and I've got two pictures at the upper left and upper right. So the upper left, of course, this is the art museum today. It's really like 8 art museums. They've got so much art, it's just unbelievable. And I mean, you can go to the Hermitage. I have people go, hey, you've been on the Viking cruise, the Viking Homeland cruise to St. Petersburg 4 times. Don't you get bored? My God, no. There's so many different excursions, and I mean, you could go to the Hermitage 4 times and not get bored just right there. But I haven't gone on all the excursions yet, so I've been there 4 times. So anyway, this is the Hermitage. This is the square in front of it. So the picture on the right shows the square in front of it. The big tall column is honoring Alexander I. He was the one that helped defeat Napoleon. This is supposedly where the communists charged across. They didn't. They came in from the other side, the riverside. The spire you see in the background is the Admiralty headquarters. When you're driving down Nevsky Prospect, you will be headed towards that building. Then when you get down there, you'll go a little bit to the left to St. Isaac's. That's, I believe, the 3rd largest church with the Christian church with a dome after the Vatican and St. Paul's. I think this is number 3. It's a beautiful church. They've got an excursion where you can go inside that. Highly recommend it. It's beautiful inside. And if you turn around now, in this particular case, I'm on the park side of this, so it would have to go around the building to the far side. And you look there, that is the Mariinsky Palace down there. Next slide. This is my last slide. Okay, I've run a little over, but hey, I always do that. And I wanted to recommend some books. So the first book that I would recommend is this book. You probably can't see this, but this is by Leon Trotsky. I mean, if you're gonna read a book on the Russian Revolution, might as well read it from the guy that made the Russian Revolution, actually made the tactical moves. Another book would be the second book that I have recommended there is The Russian Revolution by Daniel Pipes. I don't have a picture of that book here because it's an ebook. My wife is so happy I have ebooks. This is the best non-communist single book on the Russian Revolution. Daniel Pipes. Absolutely recommend that if you just want to read one book. And then there's Robert Service and Robert Conquest. Here is one book. This is by Robert Service on Lenin, so it takes a little bit different cut at it. And then here is another book that is really pretty interesting. This is by Bruce Lockhart. This is Riley, Ace of Spies. Okay, so this is book. It's absolutely true. Lockhart was the British representative. He was not the ambassador, but he was the British representative. It is also in the form of a very excellent series, TV series from Britain, Riley, Ace of Spies, which you can get. This is on DVD, Riley, Ace of Spies. This is really good. It's absolutely true. And then there's the Teaching Company. I love the Teaching Company. They have so many very good tapes. This one is by Professor Steinberg and is very good on Russian history and the Russian Revolution. So that is the end of the lecture, and we're going to have some questions next, and I'm going to let Heather organize those, and she said I could tell one story before the questions. So the story is about my Swedish relatives. Now, the rich ones stayed behind in Sweden, the poor ones came over to America. Okay, it's a pretty familiar story in America, right? And the family stayed in touch. That was 120 years ago. They stayed in touch for, oh gosh, like 60 years by letters. And finally, after World War II, we started having visits back and forth. It was first the Swedes that came over. So in 1946, they came over and I met them. Okay, and the Swedish relatives were 4 young cousins. Okay, 2 of them were brothers. There were 4 young cousins, and they were the ones that were going to take over the Saxon and Lindstrom Printing Company, which was pretty big in Sweden, exclusive rights for the king. So it was way up there. So the head of the printing company, the patriarch, said, hey, look, you guys, there's 2 countries that are going to make a difference after World War II. One is the United States. The other is Russia. I want you guys to go take a trip to both those countries so you know what they're like. So they came over to the United States. I met them. The next year they went to Russia. They went all around Russia. And of course, the Russians are really giving them a pretty good tour because they know they're very influential in Sweden. And the Swedes, being Swedes, I mean, hey, they're ready to pull anybody's leg. They decide that they're going to play a joke on the Russians. And the 2 brothers are in a hotel room. They know the hotel room is bugged. So they decide they're going to have a little fun. And they're talking back and forth, and they're going, God, wasn't this an absolutely fabulous tour of Russia? I mean, these people are so good. I just wish when we went back to Stockholm tomorrow, we could take some of that excellent Russian caviar. So they're out at the airport the next day. They're saying goodbye to their guides, and sure, last minute thing, they come up with a whole bunch of Russian caviar. That's typical of my Swedish relatives. They are truly a piece of work. Okay, Heather, end of story. See if you got some questions.
Thank you, Bill. Our first question tonight comes from Gail in Lancaster in the United States. She asks, what happened to Trotsky?
Interesting story. Trotsky was the one that really made the Russian Revolution happen. So the Bolsheviks were able to take over. And then there was a civil war for about 4 years. He was in charge of the Red Army. And he was successful. I mean, he really wasn't a military man, but he had a pretty good brain on his head, and he managed to concentrate. The whites, or the opposition, was divided into 3 different groups, and he was able to defeat each one individually. So that was Trotsky after war. Now, when Lenin was almost assassinated, and later he died from the wound, which was a bullet next to his neck. Next to his spine, they couldn't take it out. When he died, it became a question of who would control the party, Trotsky or Stalin. And Stalin managed to outmaneuver Trotsky. Trotsky was eventually exiled and he ended up in Mexico. And Stalin wanted to get rid of him, and he sent over a secret agent that at first was a helper for Trotsky, and Trotsky didn't have any money, so he was looking for helpers. And he came in one day to assassinate him. This is kind of gory, but I'm going to tell you what happened. The guy had an ice pick, like for mountain climbing, and he cut off one half of it so that he just had half of an ice pick. But of course, that's pretty. And he put it under his arm, under a coat. And then he walked up. Trotsky is working at his desk. He walks up and he pulls this out and he goes, whack, right in Trotsky's head. And of course, a few days later from the infection, Trotsky died. So that's what happened to Trotsky.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Barbara in the United States. She says, why have a Soviet council in addition to the Duma?
Because the Soviets didn't want to have the provisional government. They didn't want to have the democracy, okay? And so they formed, just the social revolutionaries, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks formed the Council of Soviets. And Lenin was going all power to the Soviets, and that's why they had the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was just the left. They got rid of the middle class by having the Congress of the Soviets. So the provisional government didn't want that, and the provisional government wasn't going to do that. What they were going to do is they were going to have a constituent assembly, write a constitution, then have a vote for, you know, whatever parliamentary form that the people wanted. Okay, the Congress of Soviets didn't want that. They wanted just power to the Soviets. And of course, Trotsky was able to take control of that very cleverly, put his men in all the right committees, and had really basic control over the Council of Soviets.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ash in the United States. He says, what does the name Mariinsky mean?
It's just a name. It's just a name, like Potemkin. It's just a name.
Thank you. Next question from Angela in Lake City in the United States. So she says, I found it very interesting that both Lenin and Kerensky were taught by Kerensky's father. What fascinates me most about these turning points in history is the psychology behind the actions. It makes me wonder whether the father's views and teachings were what influenced the students, and if he was still alive to see the events unfold between his son and his former student. What are your thoughts on how this single influence can change the course of history?
Well, I think what happened is he educated them till they were very good students, then recommended all of them to go to the best university in St. Petersburg. Once they got to the university, I think they were out of his influence. So Kerensky went one way, which was the social revolutionaries, democracy, etc. And Alexander Ulanovsky, the Bolsheviks really didn't exist in, but Lenin really went with the Bolsheviks. He was more interested in the Marxist point of view. So probably the influence of Alexander Kerensky's father was lost once they got to St. Petersburg. Good question.
Thank you. Next question comes from Thomas in Boston. He says, what would have happened if Nicholas had not abdicated on behalf of the Tsars? Would the monarchy have survived?
No, I don't think so. I think pretty much the monarchy was doomed just because of the incompetence in World War I. If it hadn't been the train being stopped out in the middle of Russia, it would have been something else. So I think if Tsar Nicholas had gotten back to St. Petersburg, he would have been overthrown. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question from Astrid in Jackson. She says, how was the Russian Revolution viewed by America at the time? Was the government then worried or concerned by the events?
Oh, yes. Of course, there's a spectrum. There were certain people that supported the communists, okay? But by and large, the government did not. The United States government did not recognize the communist revolution, not until Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Thank you. Next question from David in Orlando. He says, why did the communists want to eliminate religious worship in Russia?
Well, that's a very good question, okay? Because we see that today, okay, in China, frankly. And the thing is that religion is an organization. And therefore, it represents to the communists a power structure, a competitive power structure. So they don't want a church. They don't want unions. They don't want any organization that other than the Communist Party. So the real key for the communists, and it's Marxist, Leninists, the key with Leninism is they want power, sole power, and they want to eliminate any other form of power. So that's why they were interested in eliminating the Orthodox Church in Russia.
Thank you. Next question comes from Paul in Salt Lake City. He says, contemporary Russians I've known seem pretty nonchalant about their country's communist period, with some referring to it as our 70-year experiment. Do you think that's a pretty typical attitude today? Of course, Lenin statues and other Soviet symbols remain in place all over the country.
Well, that probably depends upon the age of the Russian person. If they're older, they didn't like, and they fled to the West, they didn't like the Russians at all. Okay, so I grew up with a Russian family. Zoya Beach was the mother, and I've forgotten what her Russian maiden name was. But when just to give you an example of the older people, so when I went to Stanford, I learned Russian. I studied it for 2 years, and so I saw her, and of course I knew she was Russian, of course, and so I said, showing off my Russian, I said, "Dobry den, tovarich." That means good day, comrade. Comrade, the tovarich was used by the communists. Oh, she looked at me with just the most evil look, and she went, "Niet, tovarich." So from the bottom of her soul, she remembered they fled Russia, and they absolutely hated the communists. Now, you might get people that have come since 1990 over here that really have not really experienced Russia. I've talked to a few of them. They don't, I mean, I was there in 1972, so I kind of knew what it was like. These people had no experience of that. And they come over and they might look, the younger ones might look back and say, oh, you know, it was just a period of history.
Thank you. We just have a comment here from Dennis in Largo in the United States. He says, warm regards. We visited Moscow and St. Petersburg in 1995 and trod the deck of the Aurora after being simply waved aboard by a bored young uniformed guard.
Yeah, you can board that. You can board it today. So, and 1995, that's pretty interesting. I was there in 2000, and when I went in 1972, I went in from Finland by train to, it was Leningrad at the time, and when I went to the Russian border, I was strip searched down to my underwear, okay? So in 2000, I went back and I took my sons. I get off the plane at the airport in Moscow, and I'm going like, well, what's this going to be like? Some bored guy at the border patrol just waved me through. Quite a change.
Thank you. Next question comes from Loretta in New Hartford. She says, what kind of man was Tsar Nicholas? Do you think he was a weak leader, or do you think that by this point, the culmination of so many events meant he had little choice and was unable to do anything to change the course of history?
No, I think Tsar Nicholas was just way above his competence level. I think Carolyn Malloy, by the way, another episode that's worth looking at on Viking.TV, I think it's Viking episode, go to previous Tuesday's episode 35, it's Imperial History. And Carolyn Malloy says, you know, when he was imprisoned by the provisional government, it was out by the Catherine Palace, and he gardened, and he was really happy doing that. And I think that's about his level. I think he was a good gardener. Running a country, absolutely incompetent. If it had been Alexander I, if it had been Alexander II, history could have been different. But Nicholas, complete incompetent.
Thank you. Next question from John in Holland in the United States. He says, please could you speculate on the elevation of Lenin over Trotsky? What would have happened if Trotsky had been supreme?
Well, Trotsky had a big ego, and he probably would have liked to have been in charge. I mean, he thought he was the answer to everything. But Lenin was just a really strong character, and there was no doubt Lenin was in charge. If Trotsky had managed to get in charge and avoided Stalin, Trotsky, what he believed in was constant revolution. So I think he would have kept attacking through Poland to Germany in Europe. It would have been quite different. What Lenin did and what Stalin did is they went, God, we've got to consolidate power. Okay. So they agreed they would make any deal possible so that they can consolidate power. They gave independence to Finland. They gave independence to the Balkan states. They gave independence to Georgia. They gave independence to all these separate countries that made up the Russian Empire. Later, they would go back and try to conquer all of those, but they gave them up because they would make a deal. They even gave up the principles of communism with the new economic policy, which they allowed free property. Okay, I mean, they had a free enterprise at a small level, not the big factory level, but at the small level. So it would have been different. Okay, Lenin managed to preserve the revolution. I think Trotsky would have kept attacking, and I think he would have been defeated, and so it would have been different.
Thank you. Next question comes from Bruce in Fort Worth in the United States. He says, did you know Kerensky at Stanford?
Yes. Well, I mean, we weren't drinking buddies or anything like that. He came over to our dorm. You know, he gave a talk. I was able to ask him 3 questions. I mean, he was like 10 feet away from me, so I knew him for that night, for that evening. Yes, but I didn't study under him or do anything like that.
Thank you. Next question from Jeff in Chicago. He says, did the Tsar's daughter Anastasia survive the assassination of her family members? Some have claimed that she lived a full life in the US.
Yeah, I know there's lots of claims to that, but I don't think that happened. I think they have found that out from the bones that they have, that everybody in the family was assassinated, unfortunately.
Thank you. A slightly different question now from Lenny in Oslo. She says, absolutely fantastic talk. This is a question for you. If you should be stuck on an island for some years with just 5 books from your 7,000 in collection, which would you choose to bring?
Oh my God. That's too hard. That's too hard. I love all my books. I couldn't choose just 5. I'm sorry. That's just too hard to do. My wife keeps wanting me. She says, oh, look at that book. Have you read that in the last year? Why don't we throw it out? I can't throw out a single book. I couldn't choose just 5. Sorry.
Thank you. A question now from Kathleen in Corvallis in the United States. She says, was the Viking ship port that you showed in St. Petersburg, was that for the ocean ships, the river ships, or both?
No, that's for the ocean ships. So all the cruise ships will come into that harbor. Yeah, and it's very interesting. The Vasilevsky Island is very interesting. So you'll come in, you won't see downtown, but you'll see the great big Gazprom building that goes up 1,500 feet. It's a great big spire. So that's pretty impressive. You'll see the soccer stadium, and you'll see some of the new apartment houses that they're constructing on that part of the island as you drive through. And then you'll go to the older city.
Thank you. Just a nice comment here from Howard in Burke in the United States. He says, no questions, but just wanted to thank you for a most informative lecture. They're scheduled to take Vikings Russia and the Baltic Sea cruise in June this year. So he says, thank you for the historic perspective.
Good. Well, I hope to be there on May 17th on Viking Venice, but sorry, I'll miss you in June, but you should have that's an excellent time of year, and you should have an excellent cruise. And I hope that this will give a little more meaning to the buildings that you'll be able to visit in St. Petersburg.
Thank you. Next question is from Simon in Richmond, Virginia. He says, how did the 700 people who made up the Duma take their places? Were they all elected?
Yes, they were all elected. So they had elections. This was the intent of the provisional government, was to come up with a constitution and figure out if you want one big parliament or 2 houses like the United States. When that would be decided, they would be voted. Okay, and that was different than the Soviets. Okay, the Soviets the people might be elected to the Soviets, but which Soviets got in that building, the 700 Soviets that got in the building out of the 100,000 people that were on Soviet committees, that was a real trick.
Thank you. Gudrun in Big Fork would like to know what happened to the Tsar following his abdication.
He was originally taken to the military headquarters. Tsarina was placed under arrest by the provisional government in St. Petersburg. And then they went out to what they call Tsarskoye Selo, which is a small building, small compared to the Catherine Palace. But to the south of St. Petersburg is the Catherine Palace. That's an excellent Viking excursion. Beautiful palace and beautiful grounds. And just as you come up with the buses and you get out of the buses, if you look to the right behind an iron fence, you will see that's the place where they were kept. Small by comparison to the Catherine Palace, big by anybody else's comparison. And that's where the Tsar had his garden. And then they moved him to the center part of Russia because they were afraid that white Russian troops, the resistance to the Reds, would come in and free him. So they moved him to central Russia in Ekaterinburg, and then that's where they were assassinated later on.
Thank you. Next question has come from Shelton in Silver Spring. He says, given the early support of the communists by Germany, what are the key factors that led to the deterioration of their relationship leading up to World War II?
Oh, it was, believe me, first of all, it was the monarchists that were in control of Germany that wanted to support the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks would be politically the last people on the face of the earth that the monarchists would want to support. They did that totally because the Bolsheviks wanted out of the party. After World War I, actually, the Germans had a relationship with the Russians. The Russians needed technology, and the Germans needed a place to practice with their tanks and their airplanes. So secretly, they dressed up as Russian troops, and they were allowed to practice tank tactics and aircraft tactics inside Russia. This is 1920s, maybe in the probably 1930s at the very latest. So there was a relationship, but it's kind of like two porcupines. They were not exactly, hugging each other, but they each had something that the other wanted. Then in the 1930s, and this is really kind of interesting, the Germans were doing whatever they could to prep the Soviet Union to be easier for them to conquer. That was always Hitler's aim, was to conquer the Soviet Union. And one of the things was that they played on was the rivalry between Stalin and Trotsky. Now, Trotsky was the head of the Red Army, right? So he was exiled, I think in the late 1920s, but Stalin was worried that the people in the Red Army were still favorable to Trotsky and not to Stalin. So he basically eviscerated, as was demonstrated with numbers yesterday in the lecture, which is a very good lecture, probably 95% of the officer corps. Okay, so then the Russian-German relationship was deteriorating, but they cooperated in Poland, where the Russians attacked from the east, the Germans attacked from the west, and they split it down the middle. And there was an agreement that the Russians could have control of the Baltics, etc. So they were making agreements. It's kind of real politics. There was no love ever, but it was real politics. And finally, the Germans got ready to attack, and they attacked in June 1941.
Thank you, Bill. And probably the last question we've got time for tonight comes from Bruce in Green Valley in the United States. He says, why did the cathedrals in the Kremlin survive?
Well, the cathedrals, the Kremlin, of course, is the center of Moscow. So they always kept that up. The communists kept that up. But the cathedrals were really neglected, and some of them were torn down. So like St. Isaac's, you see, which is the most beautiful cathedral in St. Petersburg, that was totally neglected. Okay, totally neglected. So, I mean, when I saw it in 1972, it was kind of painful to look at because they did nothing. It was just run down because they left it. They didn't tear that particular one down. There was another cathedral in Moscow. They turned it into a swimming pool inside, and then later they just tore it down. So they weren't saving a lot of the cathedrals. Where you drive, if you drive from the church on Spilt Blood down to Nevsky Prospect, where you'll make the right-hand turn, you'll see the Cathedral of Kazan, which is there. That is the head of the Orthodox Church in St. Petersburg. When I was there in 1972, that was a museum of atheism. So they consciously did everything they could to eliminate the church. Some of the cathedrals managed to stand, but many of them did not. So I thank everybody for their questions, and I look forward to seeing, I hope, some of you on the May 17th cruise, the Viking Homelands cruise. And I thank everybody for their very interesting questions. Thank you very much.